Hello everyone and welcome to Healthy Mourning channel. I am so glad to be with you here today on June 1st because this is a very exciting day for the Healthy Mourning community. Healthy Mourning Revolution has just launched Healthy Mourning Revolution Radio, which is a podcast. And so what I'm going to be doing is once a week, I am going to go on YouTube and I will talk about the same topic on the podcast, but I'll be talking about the topics from two different angles. So you can listen to the podcast and get some information, and then listen to the YouTube and get some more information. And I invite you to subscribe to both the YouTube and the podcast. I will put all of that information in the description link below. So today's topic is what is healthy mourning? Because I think we need to start right there. We need to understand what true healthy mourning is all about. My book, Healthy Mourning, Happy Loving, is about conversion techniques and how do you convert grief to mourning. But in order to understand that, we have to go back a step and understand that grief and mourning, although often the terms are used interchangeably, they're actually not the same thing. Grief is the internal constellation of experiences that we have, reactions that we have to the loss in our life, and it can be any loss in our life. We talk about grief in terms of grief from death. We also have grief from all manner of traumas that we experience. We certainly are all experiencing grief around what's going on in the world right now, right? So there are many different levels of grief. Grief is the internal reaction and response to whatever we perceive as the loss. Mourning is the external expression of that internal experience. And here's the key. It's possible to hide from that internal experience. It's possible that that internal experience happens before we even know that it's happened, and that we bury and carry it long before we have conscious awareness of it. And so converting it to mourning becomes really challenging because we're numb to it, we're not aware that it's going on. What happens though is if we do bury and carry our grief, and if we don't address it and allow it to convert to mourning, then the symptoms that we experience harden over time. So we experience symptoms on 5 different levels. We experience physical symptoms of loss, which can be achy joints. It can be a heaviness in our bodies. It can be really hard to get up in the morning out of bed. We may be experiencing sleep disturbance. We may be experiencing eating disturbance. We may experience aches in our body. We may be experiencing rashes, all manner of physical symptoms, right? That get worse over time instead of softening over time because we're not slowing down and listening to our grief and converting our grief to mourning. Instead, we're bearing it and carrying it, and we're not even aware of what's going on or that it is in any way connected to our grief. We have mental symptoms of confusion and loss and not being able to concentrate or follow a conversation, not being able to add 2 and 2 together, particularly in the very early days of grief. We have emotional symptoms. We may be feeling numb. We may be feeling angry. We may be feeling guilt, blame, or shame. We may be feeling fear and anxiety. We may be having panic attacks and we've never had them before, and we don't even recognize what they are. There's a whole slew of emotions that come along with the grief, right? We may be experiencing social symptoms where we're feeling really isolated and alone in our grief, and not sure what to do with that and not sure how to reach out. We may be discovering that we have secondary losses of our friends and our family that's no longer there for us because they're in their own grief journey, right? Or friends that just don't know how to be with us in grief, and so they move away. I did a Facebook Live in our Facebook group, the Healthy Mourning Revolution Facebook group today, where we were talking about the buck up and the move on messages that we can get from people who don't really understand our grief journey because they've never been in it. And so they give us these messages that really don't help us at all, and what do we do with them? That's a whole social conversation, right? And then we have our spiritual symptoms where we might be doubting our faith. We might be having a really hard time with a spiritual conversation, or connecting with our spiritual community that may think that we shouldn't be grieving, that we should be happy for our loved ones. So there's a whole myriad of things that happen and that get caught on our inside that is longing for expression. Because here's the thing about grief. Grief is the journey from the world where our loved one lived and breathed and was in physical form with us, to coming to a reconciliation with the fact that they're not part of our physical world anymore. And we need to come to terms with that, and reconcile with that, and at the same time discover where the relationship is now. Because as most of you may know by now, if you've heard me speak at all, because I always pull out this quote, my favorite quote about grief is, "Death ends a life, not a relationship." And that's so true. So part of the grief journey is the reconciling with the loss, and part of the grief journey is finding where the relationship is now and reclaiming the memories and reconnecting to the love in ways that we can't even imagine when we're early on in our grief. And so the way that we do that is by consciously converting our grief to mourning, which doesn't mean that we're doing it 24/7. We need to dose ourselves. We need to take breaks from it. We need to have ease with it. And yet it does mean that if we do this consistently, if we find our pathway to healthy mourning and to listening to the guidance of our grief, so that we learn how to express our grief out in healthy ways, when we really learn how to do that, then we find that the journey through grief is one of ease and grace that delivers us to this place quite miraculously, where we begin to reconcile with the physical loss of our loved one, and we begin to embrace where the relationship is now. And we find, because we're connecting with where the relationship is now, we find that we can reclaim those memories. And after we've told the stories, and after we've shared what this loss has been for us, and after we do the conversion techniques, we find that we can reclaim the joy, and that there comes a time when we think about our loved one and we're not crying anymore. We think about our loved one and it's a warm embrace in our heart. It's not the anxious, I don't know if I want to go there. Because what happens when we don't do this is we have the buried and carried grief, and we all know the people who couldn't possibly touch into their memories of their loved one. And so their memories are gone forever because they're so afraid of going into their grief. Grief is not the enemy. This is the point that I really want to make on this YouTube video. We treat grief like the enemy. We treat grief as something that we need to fight and we need to hide from and we need to push away from. We say things like, "I only cried once today," or "it wasn't such a bad day because I wasn't really feeling it, I was more numbed out." And we celebrate being numbed out, and then we look for ways to numb out, right? We look for our grief avoidant patterns of behavior that work for us, and then we do it, and we turn on the television mindlessly. Now, I want to be very clear about this. When we need to dose in the early stages, it's very important that we take it little bits at a time. We want to watch out for the place where the dosing behavior that works for us in the early stages can become patterns of behavior that then encourage us to bury and carry our grief. So we want to find where that line is, and we want to learn how to embrace our grief, not run from it, not push it away, not make it the enemy. Because your grief isn't the enemy. Your grief will show you the pathway to your healing and to your hope. And so what I'm all about in the Healthy Mourning Revolution is I'm all about revolutionizing the way we think about our grief and the way we think about our mourning and the way we think about somebody else's grief and mourning, so that we can be of support to them in ways that are truly supportive of them and not delivering buck up, move on messages that have no meaning and can be so incredibly hurtful, right? Just because you're saying something that may be true, and it may not be true, but it may be true, doesn't mean that it's helpful. When we learn how to embrace our own grief, we also learn how to support other people who are grieving. And at this moment in time, when we are in the COVID pandemic, we are also in a grief pandemic where all of our buried and carried grief is coming up to the surface and it's asking to be healed. The good news about buried and carried grief is that it's never too late. The good news about buried and carried grief is that we can do what's called catch-up mourning. And as we do that catch-up mourning, so do we begin our healing journey, and we begin to tap into the hope that we will once again be able to recommit to our lives in a way that maybe we haven't been able to since the time that they died. And for those of us, and there are many of us who travel years and even decades with carrying that hurt and that anger and that frustration and that fear that was all born on the day that they died and in our grief journey. If you're feeling that fear so keenly, if you're feeling that anxiety, or if you're blowing up in anger, know that what's happening is those symptoms that are natural symptoms of grief perhaps hardened over time with you. That is the evidence that you're bearing and carrying your grief. And so if you're ready to be free of that, if you're ready to truly embrace your grief, catch-up mourning is possible. Now, the good news is we're about to do another launch, and it's a live launch of the Healthy Mourning Revolution. And what that is 9 days, and it's a completely free program that I invite you to be a part of. I will put a link down below. You can go to healthymourning.com to get links to my book, to get links to the podcast, to get links to the free Facebook group, and to register for the live launch. So the next live launch is there for you, and we do those live launches quite regularly because we want to make sure that people have the tools so that you understand what the myths of grief are, so that you understand what it is that will take you that next step if what you're needing to do is some catch-up mourning that will wake you up to those grief avoidant behaviors. So I'm hoping that you will be able to join us for that. In the meantime, I'm hoping that this was helpful to you. If so, please put a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure that you subscribe to the channel so that you get notifications when we do the next one. Like I said, we're doing this once a week, and we're partnering it with our podcast, where we give a little different information in the podcast so that you get a fuller experience of the topic every week. The other thing we've started, and we started it last week, we're posting another one this week, is our resource review. And that is for resources, because my clients come up to me, many people have come up to me, they've emailed me asking me, so what are the best books for me to look at? And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing a resource review of grief support materials that I know have been tremendously supportive of myself in my grief journey, have been supportive of my clients, and that I know can be of support to you. So I look forward to connecting with you. If there's a topic you would like me to put on the list, please let me know, and we'd be happy to add that to our podcast and video list. Until next time, may you journey through your grief with ease and grace. Namaste.